No one noticed the first imbalance in the line, but the line had already begun to change. The silence was no longer perfect. It had started to drift. The body began to correct itself before the mind gave permission, and no one noticed the difference. And then the line stopped moving as one. It started moving as many. The command arrived, but not all bodies received it at the same time, and that delay changed everything. It was no longer one line responding. It was many soldiers reacting at different times. The line still looked whole, but it no longer moved as one. And then the line stopped waiting. It started choosing. The line did not break. It was already breaking when the first body fell. The formation still existed, only as shape, not as order. The command was still being given, but the battle had already moved on. There was no longer a battlefield to command, only fragments of action happening at different times. The army was no longer an army, only soldiers, separated by timing, not space. Even instinct has limits, and the body begins to remember it before the mind does. The battle did not end. It simply stopped burning as fast. The battle was no longer one event. It had become many endings happening at different times. The noise did not end all at once. It faded in pieces across the field. There was nothing left to fight. Only what remained after fighting had already finished. It was not victory that remained. It was understanding, arriving too late to change anything. They were no longer soldiers in that moment. They were only men trying to understand what they had become. They remembered it differently now. Not as battle, but as moments they could no longer change. It did not feel like victory. It felt like something had ended without asking them. It was no longer happening. It had already happened, and they were only now seeing it clearly. There was nothing left to process. Only the certainty that it could not be undone. It no longer remembers itself as war. It exists only as what remains after remembering stops. The event no longer exists in time. It only exists in what time left behind. The battlefield no longer exists as a place. It exists as something that has already been understood. What happened here does not continue. It only remains. This was not the end of a battle. It was the beginning of it becoming history. Even meaning begins to fade when there is nothing left to attach it to. What was once movement is now only placement in space.
There is no longer a story here. Only what remains when stories stop.
Nothing here is happening anymore, yet nothing has disappeared. The mind has stopped asking questions, but the world has not answered any. What remains is not memory, but matter without explanation. There is no longer a difference between what mattered and what did not. What once was war is no longer recognizable as anything at all. It does not point to anything anymore. It only exists.
Nothing here explains itself anymore, and nothing needs to.
There is no longer a story to extract from this place, only presence without context. What remains is not what happened. It is what is left when happening ends. The battlefield no longer describes itself, because nothing is left to describe. What was once called war no longer has a name. There is no longer a difference between what happened and what simply exists. There is nothing left to interpret, because interpretation has no target anymore. What remains does not point to anything else. There is nothing left to show, because nothing is left that needs to be seen. There is no center anymore. Everything has become equal in silence. What happened here no longer has any order to follow. Even silence does not point inward anymore. It simply exists everywhere at once. There is no longer a system to describe this, only space remaining. What remains cannot be named, because naming requires separation. Even language fails to divide what remains. It was never about what happened here, only that it existed at all. There is nothing left to show, because nothing is left that needs to be seen.